Thank you for coming to the State of Religious Freedom in the United States and Europe as it is presented here by KARAMAH. This is one of the really important organizations in the city working around the world, and we're so pleased that you're here and to host you here today. I bet that this event was planned before you knew what you know now. When this event was planned, the world was a little bit different, even if it was a week or two or 1 month ago. And so the events of the past month, of the past weeks, of the past days, of the past nights always shape the conversation. So we come today with a conversation that we would not have had a week ago. I was just saying to Rabbi Saperstein, I wish the world would stop for just 24 minutes or 24 hours so I could catch up, but somehow it doesn't do that. But we are here gathered as a community to share both our intellectual and our other interests. So thank you so much for coming. It is my deep pleasure to introduce the people who are presenting today. Aisha Rahman, who is the Executive Director of KARAMAH and also serves as the head of the organization's Civil Rights Division. I have to say one personal word. I was at Emory University for a very long time, and I knew her before she grew up. And it's a real pleasure to be in the city of Washington working together. I know stories, but she does too. It's also my great pleasure to introduce to you Engy Abdelkader, who serves as the advisor with the Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe's Office for Democratic Institution and Human Rights, and is a member of the United States Department of Religion and Foreign Policy Working Group. It's a pleasure to have you here, and I'm so glad that you're here. And Ambassador David Saperstein comes to us in this role as Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom. He is not a stranger to the city and a stranger to the work of religious freedom in the United States, around the world, or in this room or in this building. So you are all so welcome, and I look forward to helping us as the time comes for leading our conversation and moderating our questions.
Welcome, everybody. I'd like to begin my remarks by thanking my longtime mentor and friend, Reverend Susan Henry Crowe, who now is the General Secretary of the General Board of Church and Society here at the United Methodist Church. As she mentioned, I knew her when I was a freshman at Emory, and she invited me to serve on the Interreligious Council. And I have to say that she then and now has dedicated her life to the work of religion. And to say that she has always been an advocate for the rights of Muslims is really an understatement. So I'd like to thank her for hosting us today. She is a true ally, and I couldn't be more pleased that you're now in DC with me. On behalf of KARAMAH, I would like to welcome all of you here today. Thank our esteemed panel for speaking on this very important issue. Several months ago, Ambassador Saperstein invited me to attend an event in New York that talked about the nexus between women's rights and international religious freedom. At that event, you asked me a very provoking question, which is, what can the United States and other countries that stand for religious freedom do to help the cause of religious freedom globally? I've thought a lot about this question and the global situation that we are currently living in. With daily horrifying reports from anywhere such as Burma or Nigeria or various countries in Europe, the stories of religious minorities facing incredible discrimination are too numerous for us to list now. And our work on international religious freedom is clearly cut out for us. That said, we are lucky in the United States to live under the U.S. Constitution. Our First Amendment prohibits the making of any law respecting an establishment of religion or impeding the free exercise of religion. Article 6 of the Constitution says that no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. These fundamentals, the law of the land, sets out equal protection of all religious groups in the U.S. However, the situation beyond the law has shifted greatly since the time of our forefathers. Often, American media and governmental bodies want to point fingers at what other countries globally are doing wrong with respect to religious freedom. We want to criticize other countries for their treatment of religious minorities and for not giving equal rights and protections to all. Yet, in the U.S., Muslims and other religious minorities are faced with second-class treatment every day. It is clear that global events are impacting our domestic scene. Because of a select few that are committing horrendous crimes in the name of religion, people, institutions, and governments are turning against Muslims under the model of collective blame. This is not the first time the United States has compromised the rights of an ethnic or religious group. We all remember that during World War II, we saw the internment of nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans. Even then, our country turned to the U.S. Constitution for support, and yet it was still a very dark time in our nation's history. Now, many in the U.S. are calling for this same solution once again of interning Muslims. Daily, we are hearing rhetoric that Muslims should not run for public office. Just in the last few months, we have heard reports in the U.S. of more and more mosques and schools being denied zoning permits. According to the Department of Justice, since 2010, 36% of the department's RLUIPA land use investigations have involved mosques and Muslim schools. That was just in 1 year. In the previous 9 years, from 2000 until 2009, that percentage was only 11%. Muslim cases are more likely to require the filing of a lawsuit to vindicate rights. Again, according to the Department of Justice, 64% of investigations since 2010 have involved religious groups other than Muslims, churches, synagogues, Hindu temples, amongst others. But those cases tended to be resolved before a lawsuit was even filed. 7 of the last 8 lawsuits that we have filed under RLUIPA have involved mosques or religious schools for Muslims. There has been a clear increase in mosque construction conflicts. Some of this is attributable to demographics, but most is attributable to the animus around Muslims. Eric Treen, Special Counsel on Religious Discrimination at DOJ, says, and I quote, "All religious groups face some oppositions. Towns would rather have a Costco than have a new church, synagogue, or mosque. But when faced with the law, they tend to back down. Except with mosques, where we always need to file suit, and then only will they back down." For the past 3 years or so, schools in Texas, Colorado, and Tennessee have been fighting local and statewide coalitions to ban the mention of Islam in our history books and social studies books. While Title IV of the Civil Rights Act bars school boards from denying students equal protection of the law based on race, color, national origin, sex, or religion, these cases usually involve segregation or discrimination in school activities, discriminatory discipline, and failure to address students and student harassment. I think we can all imagine that a curriculum issue would rise to the denial of equal protection. For example, showing a film that may cause a race riot would rise to this level. But so far, there has been no case at the DOJ that has handled this issue. The outcome would have to not merely be that the DOJ thought the textbook was inaccurate, but it actually would be considered a denial of equal protection to teach the book. And that, my friends, is a very high bar, something that we would be very likely, something that would lead to harassment would likely reach that level, but DOJ would have to look at each individual case and instance to determine whether a suit could be brought. The fear, ladies and gentlemen, is that merely teaching about Islam and its impact on our world history is indoctrination as opposed to education. KARAMAH's biggest fear for all of these issues is the impact that this is having on our youth. The numbers of Muslim American youth that are being bullied, profiled, and hurt are rising every day. The message is clear. Muslim Americans are the other. It is apparent that despite religious freedom for all in our country, it is actually religious freedom for some. We must rely on the strength of our Constitution and our laws to protect our rights. In a 2010 Gallup poll, 48% of American Muslims reported racial or religious discrimination. Muslim American youth are reportedly the lowest religious group in the U.S. to consider themselves thriving. Anti-Muslim sentiment has risen to such an extreme level that this fear-mongering is working. And in the absence of multiple lawsuits, incredible resources of time and money, our civil rights are eroding every day. Before we turn to the international community, we need to remember the foundations upon which our country were founded and secure our rights now more than ever for the next generation. Only then will we be able to have legitimacy abroad and realize our full potential as a country that stands and was founded on the premise of religious freedom. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So first I want to thank KARAMAH for organizing this event, as well as the General Board of Church and Society for hosting us in this lovely building. It's my first time here, and it was inspiring to step out of my taxi and find myself facing the U.S. Supreme Court. So thank you so much for making this possible. It's wonderful to be here with all of you today. While I wear a number of hats, and as you may have seen on the promotional materials, my affiliation with the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, I actually speak in a personal capacity today and not on behalf of any of the organizations with which I'm affiliated. Sure. Is this better? A little bit? So as our host so gracefully pointed out, this event has been in the planning for a number of months, and before the tragedies that we've been confronted with in recent days and weeks. And I was actually asked to speak about the situation confronting Muslim populations in Europe vis-a-vis religious freedom. And in light of what we just saw happen yesterday, and again in recent weeks, whether in Paris or Beirut, and so many other places around the world where people are experiencing senseless violence and their lives are being irreversibly altered, I want to take a moment of silence to just remember those victims, not just here in the United States, not just in Europe, but all over the world. And may we be brought to peace, tolerance, and respect for one another. So recently we witnessed the attacks in Paris, and predictably there was a very severe backlash against Muslim communities, not just in France in terms of the emergency powers that were called for by President Holland, which resulted in more than 1,000 searches, hundreds of house arrests, and the closure of mosques in a span of just 10 days. Not just the emergence of a quote-unquote Christian state threatening to kill Muslims in Belgium, not just the closure of unofficial mosques in Italy, not just hate crimes and armed protests and hate speech, and just irresponsible political rhetoric here in the United States, but in so many different places around the world. And it would seem almost natural in that I'm speaking about European Muslims to focus on that backlash with respect to the attacks in Paris. My concern with doing that is that oftentimes we understand human rights violations, and specifically violations of religious freedom, in the context of a traumatic response to a specific triggering event, right? And oftentimes that event is terrorism or terrorist acts. And the reason that concerns me is because it feeds inadvertently into this Islamophobic narrative that Muslims deserve the treatment and bigotry and prejudice that they experience. It is brought upon them by their co-religionists. And I think that that is not only inaccurate, but short-sighted, because the relationship between human rights violations, and specifically religious freedom infractions, and terrorism and acts of violence is so much more complicated. So rather than focusing on the backlash against Muslim communities in the wake of the Paris attacks, what I'd like to do is actually take us 1 month prior to those attacks in Paris and just focus on a few of the countries that we find in Western Europe to get a snapshot of the religious freedom landscape vis-a-vis the Muslim community in Western Europe. Okay, so first I'd like to look at the United Kingdom. And again, so the Paris attacks occurred on November 13th. So I'm going to go 1 month prior and just start looking at what was happening in October of this year, okay, in these countries. So in the United Kingdom, in October, a new research study was released by the University of Birmingham City and Nottingham. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with educational institutions in the United Kingdom, these are considered among the most elite universities in the UK. They rank on the top 20 universities in the United Kingdom. And essentially, this study focused on the hate crimes confronting Muslims in the United Kingdom. Now, hate crimes are nothing new in terms of the Muslims in the United Kingdom. We know that they have long been victimized by violence in their country, and this is for a number of different reasons. Oftentimes it's understood in the context of 7/7, the July 7th bombings. It's understood in terms of the violent and senseless murder of the British soldier Lee Rigby, and more recently it's often understood as a response to the influx of refugees from Syria and Iraq because of various violence abroad. But what was unique about this particular study is that it focused on a number of different hate crimes, predominantly involving Muslim women. For instance, there was one incident where a woman was doused with alcohol while she was riding a train. There was another incident where a woman was kicked and punched by an assailant after her hijab was ripped off. And there was another incident where a woman was called an ISIS sympathizer and threatened by fellow bus passengers that they were going to blow her head off. What was unique about this particular research study was the fact that they found that there was a reluctance by the public to intervene or assist these victims. So for instance, with respect to the woman who was on a bus and called the ISIS sympathizer and threatened that her head was going to be blown off, she actually approached a bus driver for assistance, and he turned away and simply said, "I cannot do anything." With respect to the woman who was actually kicked and punched by her assailant after her hijab was torn off, she had the courage to go to the police in this current counterterrorism climate where so many people are reluctant to go to the police to report even the most violent of hate crimes. And the police officer who took her incident said to her, "Pull yourself together." And so what was unique about the finding here is that there is this public refusal to help individuals who are in desperate need of assistance. Even if individuals are afraid to put themselves in harm's way, they could easily contact law enforcement officials or try and get other people to help to stop an incident of brutal violence, and still they are not. As I mentioned, most of these incidents involve women, which is not an surprising or new finding. It's also not exceptional in terms of that it's not unique to the United Kingdom specifically. According to a nonprofit organization that tracks violent hate crimes against Muslims in the United Kingdom, Tell Mama, they have found that upwards of 60% of all Islamophobic violent attacks, whether verbal, physical, or online Islamophobic attacks, involve Muslim women who are identifiably so. This mirrors research that comes out of France. Even before the Charlie Hebdo attacks earlier this year, the Council of Europe decried the fact that hate crimes in France, predominantly upwards of 70 to 80%, impact Muslim women wearing religious garb. Again, this is pre-Charlie Hebdo, so not necessarily a response to a traumatic, violent incident that happened on French soil, but rather more likely because of the dehumanization that is occurring and stigmatization of Muslims because of discriminatory laws that have been in effect since 2004 and just continue to get worse over the years. I'll return to the question of Muslim women who are victims in Europe towards the end of my remarks. Another incident that the researchers examined involves online verbal threats and assaults against Muslims. Again, disproportionately impacting women in religious garb. So for instance, they talked about one incident where a woman who was apparently photographed with a face veil, her picture was taken and then redistributed via Twitter with a caption that said, quote, "burqa wearing slut." That's an important insult. And the reason why I note it specifically here is because the burqa wearing obviously refers to her religious garb and her religious identity as being a Muslim. But the fact that they called her a slut refers to her gender. Because if she was a man, she would not be referred to that way. And so this particular incident and so many others like it, again, not just in the UK, but in so many other places as well, demonstrates the impact of two or more identities, the intersection of discrimination. And specifically with respect to Muslim women, the fact that they are discriminated and visited by violence because of their religious identity, because they are women, and also potentially because of their race, ethnicity, and other features, including perhaps their immigration status. So, sure, I'll try to lean in. So the good news, because I always try to provide a little bit of good news to keep things hopeful, otherwise it becomes really difficult to carry on with this type of work. So the good news is that also in October, the UK government mandated all police forces to start documenting anti-Muslim hate crimes. You'll be interested to know that prior to October, only the police force in London, the city of London, used to document hate crimes as being anti-Semitic or anti-Muslim. All other police forces never indicated whether or not a hate crime related to a person's religious identity as being Muslim. Of course, this makes it very difficult to track how many crimes are impacting your Muslim population. It makes it very difficult to enact effective policies in response to escalating hate crimes. So for instance, the London police force, which had already been tracking anti-Muslim hate crimes as of October, said that from January 2015 to October 2015, there was a 70% spike in anti-Muslim hate crimes just in London. They are able to make that determination because they're actually tracking the hate crimes that are being reported to them. So it is a huge accomplishment, I think, that the government in the UK has come forward and mandated this. And so that's a positive development worth noting. Also positive, although telling and sad in a way, is the fact that because of this increase in violent attacks confronting European women in the UK, a number of women are actually taking it upon themselves to organize self-defense classes. Interestingly, this is not only happening in the UK, but is also happening in Toronto and right here in the United States as well. Positive in terms of the fact that women who are potential victims are not just laying back and allowing themselves to be targeted in this manner, but actually feeling empowered to come forth and protect themselves from potential attacks. Sad that it's necessary. Let's look at Sweden, October. About 1 month prior to the attacks in Paris, a teacher was prosecuted for Islamophobic remarks that he put on Facebook. Specifically, quote, he said, "Muslims should be roasted on glowing grills because it would be a good way of getting rid of terrorists." This is a school teacher who was prosecuted for posting this on Facebook. So here we see a conflation of all Muslims with terrorism. We also see a call for killing all Muslims. Right? The mass murder of all Muslims, which is obviously disturbing. On October 22nd, attacker targeted students in a Sweden school who looked as if they were foreign-born. He came into a school with a sword and looked for students who looked foreign to attack them. He was arrested and charged with a hate crime, according to the local police. Also in October, in a span of 2 weeks, there were over 5 arson attacks targeting refugee centers, presumably housing Muslim immigrants from Syria and Iraq. As of October, the country's far-right and anti-immigrant group, known as the Sweden Democrats, were actually the most popular political party in the country. They're accused of perpetuating and spreading fear and hatred throughout Sweden. Good news is that Sweden is expected to receive 74,000 asylum seekers this year. And that bears noting that in a number of contexts, including in the UK, there is speculation that the spike in hate crimes is also related to the influx of immigrants from Syria and Iraq into these countries. Specifically, this relates to the ongoing Islamophobic narrative that there is a Muslim or Islamic invasion of traditionally Christian majority societies. And so as a response, ordinary Muslims are being attacked and victimized. Let's move on to Germany. Approximately 1 month prior to the Paris attacks in October, 15,000 to 20,000 people marched in support of an anti-Islam hate group known as Pegida, the Patriotic Europeans Against the Islamization of the West. The rally marked the group's 1 year of anniversary. It actually started as a Facebook group that grew in popularity and essentially believes that all Muslims represent a threat to European stability and Judeo-Christian values. Its leader is reportedly a chef by trade, as well as a convicted cocaine dealer. He's been photographed as dressing up as Adolf Hitler. Following that scandal, he was forced to resign, but 1 month later resumed his post as the person in charge of the group. One of the invited speakers at that rally in October was a writer by the name of Akif Perinci. He, in his remarks, condemned immigrants, and he also said that there is a better way of dealing with them. Quote, "There are other alternatives to reacting to Germany's Muslim population, but the concentration camps are unfortunately out of action at the moment." So this was his quote at this public rally. The response by the people in attendance was laughter and applause. The good news out of Germany is that Chancellor Angela Merkel has condemned this group specifically, and the group has also inspired counter demonstrations that have been equally at large. But obviously we see that there is a very real conflict about the identity, the national identity of Germany and the place of Muslims and Islam within its country. Moving on briefly to France. In October, several mayors decided to end the practice of substitute meals in schools with large Muslim populations. So essentially for over 30 years, there was always a substitute meal that was provided to Muslim and Jewish students who were not able to consume pork. But earlier this summer, a number of mayors decided that this betrayed their concept or understanding of secularism, as understood by the French, and that they were going to eliminate all such substitutes. The problem is that in a number of these contexts, students are not permitted to bring packed lunches. So the only choice they have is to either go without eating during the school day or consume the pork. It's difficult sometimes to understand the impact of such a measure on Muslim populations. Much like other faith groups, Muslims fall along a very wide spectrum of observance. There are those that observe their tenets of their religion as they understand it very closely, and there are those who may be culturally Muslim or just self-identify as Muslim, but not necessarily observing each of the tenets as is commonly understood. But it bears noting that even with respect to many Muslims who may consume alcohol or who may engage in illicit relations, there generally is one tenet that is not violated, and that's the consumption of pork. You will find Muslims who may be doing everything else under the sun, but when it comes to pork, that's where the line is drawn. There is no pork. I don't know why that is, but I can tell you with some confidence that that is the fact. And so when you do have a measure such as this, there is a large outcry from the French Muslim community, this development actually made international news, and I can understand that some reading the story may be a little bit perplexed by the French reaction, but the French Muslim reaction was essentially, this is an attack on our lifestyle, this is an attack against us as a community, and this is an act of provocation. So very strong condemnation by the French Muslims. Interestingly, this battle concerning pork in schools also is accompanied by another battle in at least one location, one town in France, surrounding kebabs. So in one French town, this also arose in October, the mayor came forward and said that he was no longer going to allow any more kebab restaurants to open up in his town because, and this is exactly what he said it ran counter to French Judeo-Christian values. Kebab restaurants. And so it's interesting to see how the debate that once really was predominantly about religious dress, hijab, initially in 2004, thereafter in 2009 there was the so-called burqa ban, and now we're seeing conversation about cuisine, what is deemed to be Islamic cuisine. And even earlier this year, there were Muslim girls, students, who were banned from class, over 100 of them earlier this year, simply for wearing long skirts. They had already removed the hijab pursuant to a 2004 law that prohibited headscarves in public educational institutions, and now are being banned from their class because they were wearing long skirts, and the principal and other school administrators found that to be, quote, provocative and conspicuous as a religious symbol. So the reason I mention this is to say that even for those of us who may not find ourselves very impassioned about the face veil or question the French take on the hijab, the problem is that once you have these initial restrictions on manifestations of religious freedom, it's a slippery slope. It's very difficult to stop. And so as you see, we've gone from religious attire, such as the headscarf in educational institutions, to the face veil on the street, to now pork on school menus, to kebabs in a town, to girls who are wearing long skirts, not being allowed to pursue education, which is not just a religious freedom question, but a human rights question, even under the Convention for the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, because that's access to education. And I'll come back to that in a moment. So the good news in France. It's difficult to say, particularly in light of recent events, but there is one particular comment by the economy minister, Emmanuel Macron, who publicly stated that exclusion is a fact of life in France. I consider that a positive development because oftentimes it's taboo to discuss such things, but essentially when he said that exclusion is a fact of life in France, he's speaking about the underclass of Muslim French that live in our midst. And specifically, in October, there was actually a research study that was released by a think tank in France that found that Muslim men were 4 times less likely to receive a job interview than their Catholic counterpart. So 4 times less likely to receive a job interview than their Catholic counterpart. Interestingly, there are similar research findings in the United Kingdom with respect to both men and women, right? So why is this important? Well, first, there's a lot of conversation about integration, and 3 factors help facilitate integration. One is language, the second is education, the third is employment. So language, it's important for us to keep that in mind, particularly in light of the influx of immigrants coming into these Western European countries. And so as government officials who may be here, or if you have access to them, it's important for government officials to provide grants to community organizations as well as mosques who have contact with these individuals to help them learn the native language, because that will help with integration. Education is key. I mentioned earlier about the situation in France where over 100 girls earlier this year have been barred from class for wearing long skirts. This is an access to education issue for confronting women, just as it would be if we were talking about girls and women in Afghanistan. For some reason, we feel very strongly and speak very loudly on behalf of the rights of Muslim women when the perpetrators are co-religionists, when the perpetrators don't look like us. But when the perpetrators are Western, when the perpetrators are not Muslim, we become silent. The right to education stands irrespective of the identity of the victim and irrespective of the identity of the perpetrator. It is a human right that should be protected, in addition to religious freedom, which is a fundamental human right. And the same goes for employment. We're talking about social hostilities meaning private acts of discrimination that are confronting both men and women. Again, we do not flinch, we do not hesitate to talk about employment obstacles that exist in Muslim majority contexts. And still, we do not speak out against these vast injustices that are happening in Western Europe, or right here in our midst in the United States. People have a right to a livelihood. If they have the education, they have the credentials, they should be judged on their merit, not because of their skin color or because of the tenets of their faith, or no faith at all. Finally, I spoke about violence against women, and I want to quote from the Council of Europe Convention, right? Here's how they define gender-based violence. Gender-based violence against women shall mean violence that is directed against a woman because she is a woman or that affects women disproportionately. That's in Article 3 of the Council of Europe Convention. Also from Article 3A, violence against women is understood as a violation of human rights and a form of discrimination against women, and shall mean all acts of gender-based violence that result in or likely to result in physical, psychological, or economic harm or suffering to women. So my question is, why is it that we devote so much resources to issues like forced marriages and female genital mutilation and domestic violence, and still, the fact that research study after research study shows that Muslim women are being disproportionately impacted by violent hate crimes in France, in the UK, in Belgium, and even here in the United States, we are silent in the face of this injustice. That too is a form of gender-based violence. That too is a form of violence against women. And again, it seems like we are selective in the injustices we choose to speak up against. And we shouldn't be. Thank you.
Aisha, first, thanks for not just your wonderful presentation, but for once again leading the way on helping us grapple with very tough issues from both Aisha and from Engy. They're not only colleagues and friends, but people who I've really learned from over the time that we've had to work together. So I'm really delighted to be with them and honored to be part of a program that KARAMAH has put on. It does extraordinary work, primarily in the Muslim community, but the principles for which it fights actually benefit communities. The women who you defend in spousal abuse and domestic abuse situations, the principles of non-discrimination in employment, education, the rights of houses of worship to be built, the principles, legal principles that you help establish benefit all. And I'm deeply grateful for your work. And with my dear friend, Susan Henry Crowe, this institution, this building we're in, you know, I'm glad you're here keeping an eye on the Supreme Court and the Congress. If you get to do both here, but you're situated right between the two of them. The Methodists are kind of first amongst equals in the size, robustness of their presence here, helping to galvanize the interreligious community's efforts on behalf of social justice. So it's always an honor to be with you, and always an honor to be in this building. As Aisha indicated, in September, we co-hosted an event in New York with Religions and Peace on the intersection of women's rights and international religious freedom, discussing the many challenges that women face across the globe, not just in the Middle East, African, Asian countries, but within Western countries as well. It's on those that we're going to focus in our discussion with you in a few moments. I'm going to make some general comments touching a little more broadly on international issues briefly, but I too will focus primarily on the European context here. What galvanizes all of us together is the belief that for a country to say that it values religious freedom is just not enough. It's what happens to real people on the ground facing real challenges that is ultimately the test of whether or not there is true religious freedom, because so many constitutions promise religious freedom, but the reality is often sadly different. And between the promise and that reality is an aching abyss filled with the shattered lives of some of these people that you have addressed here and the challenges that they face, who are victimized, discriminated against, persecuted, oppressed because of their religious beliefs, their religious practices. And it is not just a question, as I think everyone here agrees, of the freedom to worship, but it's a right to practice, to hold, to change, to openly profess one's innermost belief, including the right to decide what religious garb someone will wear. It's the rights of people to teach and preach and practice and observe as well, and the right to hold no religious beliefs at all if that's what they want. And in my role as ambassador at large, I focus on religious freedom outside the U.S., but I think everyone knows the important foundational stone that religious freedom was here. And thankfully, because I understand our separation of church and state is not necessarily the answer. You don't need that for religious freedom here. It worked for us, and the result is in part because of that wall keeping government out of religion. We've seen religion flourish with the diversity and strength in America, match almost anywhere in the democratic world today. You know, sociologists tell us there are 2,000 religions and denominations and faith groups in the United States. Think about that. 2,000. And with all the problems we have, and I don't minimize them, we live with a sense of comedy and common vision about our role in America that is, and the rights that people should enjoy, that is really extraordinary. Just take those three prongs of the Constitution to which you referred earlier. No religious test for office, the promise of free exercise of religion, the guarantee of no establishment of religion. And just think about it this way, because it's a good guide for the test of religious freedom. What it asserts, and it did for the first time in human history, it was one of America's great revolutionary contributions to human history. What it asserts is a principle that your rights as a citizen will never depend upon your religious identity, your religious practices, your religious beliefs. That was something extraordinary. And it gave to minority religions in America, with all of the challenges that we still face, more freedoms, more rights, more opportunities than minority religious groups have known almost anywhere in the entire history of the world. It is something extraordinary. We ought to see that the struggles that we have domestically within that context, but we ought to see our achievements as a model for the rest of the world that can be a helpful model of what a society gains when it provides religious freedom. In far too many countries, however, people face daunting, alarming, growing challenges on account of their beliefs. In countries with once proud traditions of multi-faith cooperation and positive coexistence, we're witnessing religious minorities being driven out of their historic homelands. And in too many countries, prisoners of conscience suffer cruel punishment for their religious beliefs and practices. And we know that many governments, either pursuing legitimate goals or sometimes in the guise of combating terrorism or extremism, end up broadly repressing religious groups for nonviolent religious activities, imposing broad restrictions on religious life. And many of these laws overwhelmingly affect Muslim countries and Muslim communities within countries across the globe. For example, the Ethiopian government used the anti-terrorism proclamation to justify activities to detain, prosecute, and imprison Muslim leaders who protested the government's interference in religious affairs. Russia has used vaguely formulated anti-extremism laws to justify arrests, raids on homes and places of worship, the confiscation and banning of religious literature. Tajikistan bars people from under 18 from participating in any public religious activities, supposedly on the ground that exposure to religion will lead youth to violence or extremism. Chinese officials have increased controls on Uyghur Muslims' peaceful religious expression and practice, including instances of banning long beards and headscarves and limitations on Ramadan fasting. And in Western countries, where we see legal framework that promotes values of freedom and of religion and assures non-discrimination, too often government practices, societal attitudes and actions do not align with the laws and the Constitution that a country is founded on. According to the CCIF, women are the #1 victims of anti-Muslim attacks. Engy has dramatized that and lifted this up. Frankly, it was very beneficial to us. Usually this happens when we listen to Engy. We in the Religious Freedom Office are copying down information that we didn't have before. And I could see my staff intensely scribbling, and I'm, once again, we're in your debt on this. Here, many people are openly expressing concerns about the Islamization of Europe. These are words that incite acrimony and destroy a sense of the commonweal. Here, there are a whole range of laws we've been fighting over a number of years, unconnected with recent events, but just the changing realities of life in Europe that affect the Jewish community and the Muslim community both. Laws that would restrict halal or kosher slaughtering, rules against limiting circumcision, efforts to ban circumcision. The head coverings affected Jews and the right to wear a yarmulke in the school system of France as much as it did headscarves. Here, very often, more than one minority group is going to be suffering from these efforts at restrictive practices. In the language of dehumanization that was illustrated both in the United States and in Europe, here, that gives permission to people to engage in hate crimes, in discriminatory practices. And when it comes from political leaders or public influentials, then it creates an atmosphere of impunity for such activities and crimes, in which we see significant escalation. This is not emblematic of the kind of religious freedom that we believe is so necessary. In the main, Western governments have been vocal that many of these behaviors should not be tolerated, and credit ought to be given to what most political leaders have done. I would point out that there are some countries in Central Europe in which we're hearing voices that are different, that talk about their countries being Christian countries, saying they don't want Muslim immigrants or refugees coming into they only want Christian refugees coming into their country. And again, this is the kind of divisive rhetoric that gives a stamp of approval to those who engage in the kinds of activities that were described. So I want to leave opportunity for discussion here. So I'm going to put aside my remarks here that I would have given, because the truth is you're going to add much more richly to the conversation that we need to have in order to achieve the goals that we all share in common. So again, I thank you very much for having put this all together and made this possible, and I thank you all for being here and really look forward to our discussion together. Thank you.
Thank you all three so very much. There are so many things that we can comment on, and I want to give you a chance to ask questions, but three things that I want to highlight. I really appreciate, Aisha, the way you framed the issues legally. It's very helpful to keep those foundation pieces together. Engy, there were so many things that you said that were important, but I thought particularly that your comments about the public's refusal to respond is one that's really important that we should talk about, and speaking out against hate crimes and who is willing to and who not, and the devastating benefits or detriments when that does not happen. So thank you for raising that. David, I thought that your comments about language and divisive rhetoric and labeling and stigmatizing is really important for us to talk about, particularly here in the United States today. And so that the way that we use language is very, very important. So there were many more things that all of you said, but these were three of the things that I wanted to highlight. This has been so exciting, and I can tell that there's so much commitment and so much political will and so much energy to move forward as we do act responsibly in a civic society that really does uphold democratic principles. Thank you, Aisha and KARAMAH, for bringing us together in this very rich conversation, and hope that we'll see you again.